Greetings, I'm Steve Shields, author of Divergent Paths of the Restoration, 5th edition of which was published in 2021 by Signature Books of Salt Lake City. Today I want to talk about some key facts that need to be kept in mind when reading the book or using the book. The book could be read, I suppose, from cover to cover, and that might be interesting. It's an encyclopedia, as the subtitle suggests, where I've tried to list as many as possible that I could find, expressions of the movement begun in the 1820s by Joseph Smith Jr. In the front of the book, there's a section called Before You Begin, and often introductory notes and introductions aren't read by readers. I'm guilty of that myself. I want to get right into the heart of what the book's supposed to be about. But in this case, the Before You Begin section is critical for understanding what the book is, what its purpose is, and what the contents are. Very first and foremost, the book is to share the diversity of the movement. If nothing else, Joseph Smith Jr. freed the spirit of expression, and once freed, such a spirit's impossible to contain. Smith's idea of agency, sometimes called free agency, is what takes people along all those many paths. They can respond to the divine as they see fit and as they understand. Some are content with conforming to what others call the norm. Others are not content with that norm and they create their own norms. I've tried very hard to use the term in this new edition of expression. Expression is a broader term. It doesn't fit the sect denomination progression that social scientists came up with decades ago. I don't like the word schism, even though technically it simply means a breaking up or separation, but it's gotten negative connotations in our movement. Don't like to use break off. Who broke off from whom, splinter. It all implies that my group is central and all the others broke away from what my norm is. And I don't think that that can happen. My view isn't the norm. It's normal for me, perhaps, normal for others, perhaps, but not for everybody. To call someone the true church and all others apostate is the same kind of a problem. I've really tried to be objective in that. Now, I'm sure that I've made mistakes in the text of the book, and I'm sure that there won't be a few people, there'll be more than a few people rather, who will be very happy to point that out. I've also tried to avoid calling people "ite" or "ites." That was always a pejorative term from the very beginnings. When Joseph Smith's followers were called Mormonites, that was a negative term. When the church fell apart at Nauvoo and somebody became a 12ite or a Brighamite or a Josephite or a Rigdonite, those were all pejorative terms, and they meant something pejorative. They were not descriptive of the name of the people and what they were doing. Some groups, some denominations in my book have chosen to either accept the nickname, for example, the Church of Jesus Christ, founded by Alpheus Cutler. They're content to be called Cutlerites. I've had many discussions with the folks there, and they're okay with that. One of James J. Strang's organizations chose decades ago to incorporate in parentheses Strangite as part of their corporate nonprofit filing. And so obviously they've adopted that and they're comfortable with being called Strangites. Groups and denominations and fellowships and ministries are all expressions of what the movement is about. Just because someone or some fellowship is listed in this 5th edition does not mean that they are a separate group. It means that they have an expression that is a little different from others, perhaps unique. Some of the listings, of course, are clearly denominational structures. Some of them are clearly not quite a denomination, but more of a smaller group. Some of the internet expressions that I've included, and I'm sure I've just touched the tip of the iceberg on internet expressions. They come and go so quickly. May not even be a group. It's one person who has a particular viewpoint who is sharing that expression. And there are many that I've come across that are not legitimate in any way, and they're basically fake. I've tried to weed those out, but I've also tried to include them so that others can be informed. In a few cases, one of the persons behind setting up several of these internet groups told me clearly, no, I just set that up to see what would happen. It wasn't really serious. And that could be with a lot of what's in the book. It certainly is big, and almost 500 expressions are listed, but to call it comprehensive may be a little bit erroneous, simply because I don't know what I don't know. And I'm always running across new expressions. They come up periodically. Being listed in this book does not mean, it shouldn't be taken to infer anything pejorative or negative. It's simply that person or that group has an expression. I can't emphasize that enough. I've had a few people along the way say, well, I'm not a group, I shouldn't be listed. Well, but you have an interesting expression of what the gospel's all about. For example, there was a couple of people promoting, there still are a few people promoting a Jewish-like interpretation of the Book of Mormon, and they've made a Passover Seder using Book of Mormon texts. But they're, in their own mind, at least in their own confession to me, they're faithful LDS church members. And they believe they shouldn't be listed because they haven't split off from the church. And I'm saying, well, that's not the criteria here. What they're proposing with a Passover Seder is not mainstream LDS church. So it's a different expression of what that's all about. So we have proto-church movements, we have fellowship groups, we have parachurch ministries, fully identifiable denominations, and other church organizations. I've also included people who have translated ancient scripture. Some of those are still mainstream in their home denomination, either Community of Christ or the LDS Church. Listing in the book doesn't mean anything. It's not, I'm not pointing to those folks and saying, oh, they're out there. We need to be aware of these kinds of things. There are people listed in the book who have done translations of the sealed plates There's several versions of the sealed plates. There are several versions of the Book of Lehi, which is the purported content of the lost manuscript. And several translations of what we commonly call the Anthon transcript. Some of those people are not promoting anything other than I've come up with a key to translate this, to understand this in my effort to support the Book of Mormon. Well, that's legitimate, but it's also an expression that is not mainstream. I remember a conversation with one of the leaders of Community of Christ a few years ago who asked me about some of these translations, and he said, what do we do with them? And I said, well, I don't think we have to do anything with them. You're the prophet of the church. It's your purview to translate ancient scripture in the traditional view of how we have always seen what the prophet, seer, revelator, and translator of the church is supposed to do. So I try to make no judgments in the book, and I've tried really hard to distinguish what's what. One of the challenges that I have in the book is that so many of these expressions use the same name. There are dozens of Church of Christ and dozens of Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So I've tried to include some information with each entry with a key leader, and that key leader may not have been seen as a prophet or a president, but was the vocal person who was promoting that particular viewpoint. Some of them indeed are apostles and prophets, but you know, to try and differentiate has been challenging. With now more than 500 expressions, I began to realize that a chronological or alphabetical listing was not going to be sufficient. I've come up with a numbering system, an indexing system that seemed to make sense to me, where the main group would be, for example, the LDS Church 4.0, and that's Brigham Young's part of the church. And then each one that came down in history, 4.1, 4.2, but if there was somebody who came through that trajectory and then left 4.2 and did something different, that'd be 4.2.1. So it's a decimal-based outline system. It is not perfect, but it may work. They're trying to come up with some serial number for each one. That was my approach, and that's what I tried to do. So a person reading the book can see the trajectory, and I've kept them together by those index lists. So it's not perfectly chronological in that sense. But when you get back to the 4.1 or 2 or 3, then those are chronological, but then the 4.2.1 and 4.2.1.1.1, et cetera, stays in a chronological way. And so you can read that section by section and maybe understand some of that. Danny Jorgensen, a few years ago, Danny is well known in church history circles, wrote a paper that was published in Dialogue, volume 28, in the fall of '99, called Dissent and Schism in the Early Church, Explaining Mormon Vociferousness. I think it's really helpful to read that paper to understand why there are so many diverse expressions, divergent expressions of the movement. We were in an American setting. There was a lot of independent thought, independent movement, independent thinking. I think you should read Danny's paper and get a foundation in why all of this divergence. Very helpful paper, very helpful to understand that. Some have asked why there are so few expressions outside the United States, and I can only say from a perspective of how I look at it, we don't see, there's millions of members of the movement in Latin America, Africa, Asia, and Europe. But even Europe, England, we've seen a few expressions emerge, but the main part of Europe, the mainland Europe, there's only one or two that I know of. I think part of it is Greek logic. Western societies are based on linear thinking. The logic is dualistic, something is true or it is not. Eastern societies are based on the different principle of logic and thought. It's more pluralistic. It's more of an and also rather than either or. The second thing could be it's related to that inherited Greek logic, particularly in the United States setting, where the United States was basically and still is very much an individualistic culture. And we don't see a lot of that same individualism in many other countries and cultures. And that individualism perhaps takes Greek logic a little more to the extreme. Americans particularly are less likely to conform, to collectivize, or to express unity unless the institutions that guarantee their freedoms are under attack. I think there's more to be studied on the topic. There's some explanations that are available about American individualism that can be searched for on the internet. Third, I've had most of my adult life I've spent living in and ministering in Asia. And that taught me that people in non-Western societies are much more relational. People move in and out of affiliation with an institution based on the person or the people to whom they have a connection. For example, in my own experience, some are baptized as a favor to the missionary who taught them rather than a commitment to the institution. And while they may no longer attend gatherings of the institution once that missionary is gone, they always see themselves as a member because of missionary so-and-so. My experience in India is that the whole village will get baptized because the head man of the village decided to be baptized. They can't go outside that norm and confront. They're very collectively organized, and the American culture doesn't have that sort of a village mindset. I think also as regional economies grow and populations access education opportunities for improving their standard of living, societies become highly secularized within a short time. We've seen that in Europe over the last at least 50 years or more. The United States has become highly secularized. We've seen Christianity in general move from the wealthy countries to the countries that had been colonies of the European powers. There's a whole different theology there. The other and final comment that I'm going to make about why there are not so many in other places is access to church history information. They only know what their particular missionary gave them. All the church history reading and writing and journals that people who can understand English have access to are not accessible in other languages. There's not much other than denominational focused literature that has been translated into other languages. So there's no access to that information. And that also would sort of make it difficult for people to see a different perspective and move on and set up something unique from what they've been taught. So those are some key points. I would hope that you'll buy the book and read the fuller explanation that's in the front of the book, as well as the very kind introduction that was provided by Richard P. Howard, Community of Christ Historian Emeritus. And in his introduction, he talks a lot about the numbering system and the strengths that he could see in it. So thank you very much, and hope to see you another time.